don't know if you've ever felt this, but there's a moment when you realize you're carrying too much weight. And that weight doesn't always have a form. It doesn't show up on the scale, doesn't take up visible space, but it's there, suffocating every breath, every thought. Maybe it's the weight of expectations you never stopped to question. Maybe it's obligations you accepted without asking if they were really yours, or relationships you maintain more out of habit than out of true love. And then comes that uncomfortable question. Are you chasing your dreams, or the dreams someone told you should chase? Because the truth is, we spend so much time pretending we can sustain all of this, adding one more layer of busyness, finding one more sophisticated distraction, scrolling through the feed one more time to avoid having to stop and think, until there comes a point where you have to choose. Keep pretending, or do something everyone will think is too radical. You can choose to simplify. And I need to tell you, simplifying isn't that minimalist decoration thing. It's not throwing things away and posting pretty pictures on Instagram. It's not an aesthetic you wear to seem interesting. The inconvenient truth is that simplifying is an internal demolition. It's removing layer by layer until only what's non-negotiable remains, what's true, what's you without the fantasies they taught you to wear all along. Thoreau knew this over 150 years ago, when he decided to isolate himself in a cabin on the shores of Walden Pond. And I always wonder what was going through his mind, because he wasn't running away from people, wasn't becoming a mystical hermit. He just needed to discover something very specific. What remains when you remove everything that's unnecessary? He called it living deliberately, sucking all the marrow out of life. And I think that's beautiful, because it's exactly the opposite of what we do. We spend our days chasing goals we don't even know are ours, too busy to think if this makes sense. Thoreau wanted to know what it's really like to live, not what it's like to pretend you're living while checking your phone 300 times a day. And what he discovered there, alone, in the silence of the seasons that came and went without hurry, was something I think most of us spend our entire lives avoiding discovering. Because discovering this requires brutal courage. It requires looking at truths that go against everything they sold you as the path to happiness. You start to hear the silence for the first time. And I know this sounds strange, but silence isn't empty like we imagine. It's full of you, of your doubts that you always kept busy, of your fears that you never stopped to face head on, of your truths that you never spoke aloud. When you truly simplify, when you remove the noise that was always there, the empty conversations that fill the days but say nothing, the notifications that make you feel important but leave you hollow, the commitments that occupy all your time but mean nothing, what remains is an almost sacred silence, a vacuum where you can finally hear your own thoughts. And this is scary, because maybe you'll discover you don't know who you really are. I don't know if you've ever felt this, but sometimes it seems to me that we spend our entire lives being a collage of expectations, playing social roles so well that we forget we were playing, wearing masks to be accepted, to be loved, to not be alone with the naked truth of our existence. But stop for a second and ask yourself, how many of your thoughts are really yours? How many were implanted by family, by media, by that feed you scroll endlessly? The truth is, Thoreau knew that this silence, however uncomfortable it may be, is where real life begins. It's where you stop being a character and become a person again. And maybe this is scary. Maybe you're not ready for this. Maybe you prefer to stay distracted, and that's okay, because everyone is doing the best they can with what they have. And when you stay in that silence long enough, when you stop running from it with compulsive work, with infinite scrolling, with anything that keeps you too busy to think, your priorities start to appear without masks, and this can hurt. The inconvenient truth is that much of what you thought was vital, that you defended as essential, was just sophisticated distraction from the emptiness you didn't want to face, elaborate compensation for a life that wasn't being truly lived. Thoreau went to Walden to test exactly this. What remains when you remove everything that isn't vital? And his answer was so simple, it's almost offensive to those who spend their lives accumulating complexity. Very little remains. Food, shelter, a little work, a lot of free time, and the presence of existence. That's it. I know it's hard to hear this, but everything else you're chasing with such desperation, all those things you think you need to have before allowing yourself to be happy, all these goals you place between you and real life are layers you added not because they were necessary, but because you were afraid. Afraid to face the frightening simplicity of naked life. Afraid to discover you don't need so much, that you never did. And when you finally face this, when you see your real priorities unfiltered, you realize you were living someone else's life, following a script that was never written for you, chasing dreams that were implanted in your head by Instagram comparisons, by advertisements, by expectations that aren't yours. This hurts deeply, I understand perfectly, but it also frees you in a way that nothing else does, because now you can choose again, this time consciously, this time from your true center. But for what? To be who you really are, or to keep being who they said you should be? How long will you carry dreams that aren't yours? And later, when you look back, will you recognize yourself in your own life? But choosing consciously has a price, and I need to be honest with you. That price almost always involves losing people. I'm not saying this to make you anxious, but to wake you up. Because the truth is, many of your friendships are automatic, convenient, built around shared habits and not real connections. More about this you can find in the first pinned comment. But we return to what happens. You meet certain people because you always met them, because you frequent the same places out of habit, because you have stories in common that have already been told 1,000 times, but don't create anything new anymore. And sometimes it seems to me that we maintain these friendships more out of fear of loneliness than out of genuine love. When you truly simplify, when you stop sustaining conversations that go nowhere, relationships that fragment you instead of integrating you, social expectations that suffocate you, people feel this change. And not everyone understands, not everyone accepts. And I understand perfectly when you feel guilty about this, when you wonder if you're being selfish, if you're abandoning those who were always there. But stop for a second and ask yourself, do these people really see you? Do they really know you? Or do they know the version of you that you perform to be accepted? Because the inconvenient truth is that your transformation exposes their stagnation. Your courage to change reveals their cowardice to remain, and this bothers much more than we imagine. Thoreau was called eccentric, solitary, selfish, but he chose conscious solitude because he knew it was better than company that forces you to wear masks, that prevents you from being whole. And this isn't losing people, this is stopping paying the impossible price of acceptance with pieces of your soul. You don't need many friends, you need true friends. And the difference between the two only becomes clear when you simplify. It's really good for us to try to judge less, both ourselves and others, because everyone is doing the best they can. But that doesn't mean you need to accept crumbs of connection when you deserve real intimacy. And when you clean your life of these automatic relationships, of these commitments that only exist to fill your calendar, of these obligations that were never yours, something almost magical happens. Time expands. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but sometimes it seems to me that we live in perpetual rush, without even knowing where we're rushing to, always late, always owing, always chased by the clock. Thoreau said that men live lives of quiet desperation. And I find this phrase so current it's scary, because nothing has changed. We still run non-stop, still check our phones compulsively, still feel the day has too few hours, but never stop to ask, running toward what? To get where? And then, when you get there, what changes? In simplicity, you recover the natural rhythm of existence, that rhythm that's in your body but was brutally overwritten by society, where a day has space for everything that really matters. You can wake up without an alarm and let your body awaken when it's ready, work without hurry and pay attention to what you're doing, eat without guilt and truly savor, walk without destination and discover things you'd never see if you were always running. The clock stops being your master and becomes just a tool again. The truth is, there was never a lack of time. What was always lacking was courage to refuse everything that didn't deserve your time, to say no without explanation, without justification, without guilt. And now that you've said no, Now that you've consciously chosen where your time goes, you have time. Lots of time, maybe too much time for someone used to living non-stop. And this scares you a little, because now you need to decide what to do with this abundance. And deciding requires knowing yourself, requires knowing what you really want when no one is telling you what you should want. Maybe you'll discover you want less than you imagine. Maybe you'll realize you need much less than they made you believe. Maybe this is enough. Because there's a cruel and unexpected paradox in simplicity, an irony that nobody warns you about when you start this path. When all the false obligations finally fall away, when all the sophisticated distractions disappear, when you finally conquer the freedom you always said you wanted, that you always chased as if it were the final prize, you feel fear of freedom itself, a visceral and paralyzing fear that makes you question if you really wanted this, if you were prepared for this, if you know what to do with this. You see yourself naked before yourself, completely exposed, without social roles to play and hide behind, without masks to wear and pretend you're someone else, without convenient excuses to give when things don't work out. And the question that arises is absolutely terrifying, because you don't know the answer, and maybe you never did. Who am I really? Who am I when I'm not being an obedient child, competent professional, available friend, understanding partner, productive citizen? Who am I? When I remove all these adjectives that define me only in relation to others. Thoreau faced this existential void at Walden, this abyss where all certainties crumble and you're left only with the unsolvable mystery of your own existence. And he realized something that can change your life if you have the courage to accept it. The fear of freedom is the last obstacle between you and true life. Because while you're busy being what others need, while you're trapped in structures that define who you are, while you have ready excuses to explain why your life isn't what you'd like, you don't have to face the terrifying and liberating responsibility of creating yourself from scratch. But when you radically simplify, when you remove all justifications and all crutches, you're alone with your choices, completely alone. And this is terrifying because now you can no longer blame anyone, can no longer say you had no choice, can no longer hide behind the inevitable circumstances of life. You are free, genuinely free for the first time, and freedom demands that you create yourself from scratch every day, without an instruction manual, without guarantees it will work out, without a safety net to catch you if you fall. Crossing this fear without running back to the comfortable prison of complicated life is being born again. It's leaving perpetual childhood where others always decide for you and entering real adult life, radical, scary, where you are the only one responsible for who you become, for how you live, for what you do with the numbered days you have left. And in the middle of this scary and necessary rebirth, something unexpected and deeply transformative happens. Nature starts making visceral sense again, not as a romantic concept you admire from afar, not as pretty wallpaper on your phone that you look at between one notification and another, not as an idealized escape from the city where everything would be peace and harmony, but as living, raw, undeniable reality that pulses inside and outside you simultaneously. Thoreau didn't idealize nature like urban poets who've never slept a whole night under the stars do. He didn't think everything was peace and harmony and universal love. Like mystics who've never faced a severe winter without central heating preach, he knew intimately that nature is cruel when it needs to be, indifferent to your fears and desires, violent in its cycles of death and rebirth, but also absolutely true, always true, without possible pretense, without masks that hide its essence, without theater that distorts its reality. When you remove the constant noise of urban life, when you stop interpreting the world exclusively through screens that always lie a little, through filters that always beautify or dramatize, through infinite mediations that always put something between you and direct experience, the natural becomes your mother tongue again, the one you spoke when you were a child and hadn't been completely domesticated by civilization yet. You realize with a clarity that hurts that you were never really separated from the world, just distracted from it, anesthetized from it, disconnected from it by layers and layers of concrete, of technology, of abstract concepts that make you forget you are body, you are animal, you are nature too. And now that you're truly present, now that you feel the wind not as inconvenience but as the world's breath, the rain not as a problem but as necessary cleansing, the sun not as something to be avoided but as the primary source of all life, the cold not as discomfort but as an invitation to go deeper into yourself, the heat not as torture but as expansion that softens your rigidities, you understand in a non-intellectual dimension that you are this too. You are the cycle of seasons happening. In human form, the rhythm of tides pulling and releasing inside your chest, the silence of snow teaching you to slow down, the explosion of spring reminding you it's always possible to start over. You're no longer observing nature from outside as a tourist. You are nature observing itself, recognizing itself, marveling at its own existence. And this perception changes absolutely everything, because now you can no longer pretend you're separate, that you're above, that you can keep living as if you weren't part of this immense organism that breathes through you. Because when you reconnect with the natural rhythm of the world and yourself, when you stop desperately fighting against what is and start flowing with what is, your desires begin to become absolutely clear and radically honest, without the thick layers of neurotic compensation that consumerism taught you since you learned to speak, without the distortions that advertising implanted in your unconscious through thousands of hypnotic repetitions. Thoreau had few belongings in his cabin at Walden, but each one had a clear purpose and real presence. Each one was chosen consciously and not accumulated unconsciously. Each one served a genuine function and not a symbolic one. When you truly simplify emotionally, when you stop using shopping as cheap therapy for anxieties that should be faced and not medicated, when you stop chasing objects as if they could fill the existential void that only genuine presence, only real connection, only lived purpose can fill, you realize with a mixture of relief and sadness that your real desires are much simpler than everything the market tries to sell you relentlessly, much more human than algorithms can calculate, much more achievable than you were conditioned to believe. You want fewer things, but you want them truly. And this seemingly simple change from quantity to quality, from compulsive accumulation to conscious appreciation, is absolutely revolutionary in its consequences. You stop being a passive consumer who automatically responds to advertising stimuli and become an active person who chooses based on real needs, and things become simply things again, useful when they serve a function, beautiful when they awaken something genuine, meaningful when they carry history or connection, but never identity that defines who you are, never validation that proves your worth, never pathetic substitute for what really matters and cannot be bought. You discover that most of your desires weren't yours, they were implanted. And recognizing this isn't depressing, it's liberating, because now you can discover what you really want when no one is telling you what you should want. And at the center of this radical transformation of values and priorities is something modern society taught you to fear more than almost anything else, more than failure, more than poverty, maybe even more than death itself: loneliness. But when you truly simplify, when you create sacred and deliberate space for the encounter with yourself, loneliness transforms completely, stops being this terrifying monster that stalks you in moments of silence and becomes sanctuary, refuge, necessity, not punishment you suffer when nobody wants you but conscious choice you make because you finally understood your worth. Thoreau teaches you to actively desire what most people avoid their whole lives with poorly disguised desperation, because he knew from direct experience, not from abstract theory, that in conscious and deliberate solitude, you're not running from the world, as those who've never had the courage to be alone accuse. You're finding the only place where you truly exist without mediations, without convenient translations, without social masks that distort who you are to fit what they expect from you. Loneliness stops being this scary void that needs to be urgently filled with anything, anyone, any distraction, and becomes unexpected fullness, full of pure presence, of fertile silence where genuine thoughts can be born, of internal space where real feelings can be felt without immediate censorship. You realize with a clarity that changes everything that you spent your whole life with visceral fear of being alone, not because loneliness is bad in itself, but because you never learned to be with yourself without judging, without criticizing, without rejecting what you find in there. And now that you're learning through difficult and daily practice, now that you inhabit your own company without desperation or escape, you understand deeply that loneliness isn't painful absence of people. It's nutritious presence of yourself, whole, true, without the fragmentation that happens when you need to be different people for different contexts. And this presence, this wholeness that only conscious solitude can build, is exactly what you always desperately looked for in other people, but never managed to find satisfactorily because you can't find outside what you haven't patiently built inside. You can't receive from another what you haven't developed in yourself first. And when you build this solid wholeness inside yourself, through conscious solitude and deliberate simplicity, when you become genuinely complete in your own company, something fascinating and liberating happens in your relationships with the outside world. You completely stop explaining your life to others, justifying your choices, defending your decisions against criticisms you didn't even ask for. Thoreau never wasted a single second of his precious time defending Walden, justifying why he chose to live that way, convincing skeptical people he was right and they were wrong. He simply lived his truth with so much integrity and presence that his life was the only necessary explanation, the only possible defense, the only argument that mattered. The desperate and constant need for external validation is always a clear symptom of an excessively complicated life, full of false layers that you yourself don't completely believe, of choices you made out of fear or social pressure and not out of true conviction, of paths you followed because it was expected and not because your heart really wanted to go in that direction. In radical simplicity, you always act from your true and unshakable center, not from others' approval that varies with everyone's mood and interests. And this completely and irreversibly changes your relationship with the inevitable judgment that comes from all sides. You no longer need people to understand your choices, don't need them to agree with your values, don't need them to approve your path, because you're no longer living for them, trying to please, trying to fit in, trying to be accepted. You're living for yourself for the first time in your life, and for the first time this isn't destructive selfishness as they taught you. It's radical honesty, it's integrity, it's necessary self-preservation. Your life becomes self-explanatory in its internal coherence, and whoever really needs to understand will understand without you needing to teach. Whoever doesn't need to will inevitably judge and criticize and diagnose your problems. And this simply doesn't affect you the old way anymore, because you're no longer building your fragile identity in the always distorted reflection of others' gaze. You're building from the inside out, and this changes everything. And this fundamental shift of axis, from building from outside in to building from inside out, completely and radically transforms your relationship with work, with productivity, with the whole idea of economic utility that defines so much of our modern identity. Thoreau worked only enough to maintain the absolutely essential, a few hours a day when he worked, a few weeks a year when he needed money, thus freeing precious and irrecoverable time to actually live, to think deeply, to write what he felt, to feel what he lived, to exist fully without always producing something monetizable. Truly simplifying spiritually means completely rejecting, without negotiation, without middle ground, the totalitarian idea that you exist primarily to produce economic value, that your value as a human being is directly linked to your usefulness in the market. That work isn't just what you do, but who you fundamentally are. Work stops being your central identity that defines everything else and becomes simply what you do to sustain the life you really want to live. A neutral tool to reach a greater end, not the end itself, not the ultimate purpose, not the reason for your existence. You work consciously to live well. You don't live automatically to work until you die. And this apparently simple inversion is absolutely revolutionary in its implications. It's almost subversive in the current context, because the entire economic and social structure we live in depends completely on you believing, without questioning, that you are essentially what you do professionally, that your LinkedIn title defines your human value, that your productivity objectively measures your contribution to humanity. But when you radically simplify, when you courageously refuse to sacrifice your unique and unrepeatable existence on the relentless altar of the career that never ends, you discover something the system doesn't want you to know. It's completely possible to live well, live with dignity, live meaningfully with much less money, much less consumption, much less performative productivity than they made you believe. And that free time isn't a luxury reserved for the rich or a prize you earn after decades of sacrifice. It's a basic and non-negotiable right of any human being who doesn't want to reach the end of life and realize they worked so much they forgot to live. And speaking of dying, when you simplify, when you live deliberately, death stops being this scary taboo nobody wants to mention and becomes a wise counselor who reminds you every day of what really matters. Thoreau lived at Walden, conscious that life is finite, and this didn't depress him, didn't paralyze him, didn't make him suffer in advance. On the contrary, it freed him, because awareness of death automatically removes the superfluous. When you know you're going to die, when you really know this, not intellectually, but viscerally, you stop postponing the essential. Stop wasting time on what doesn't matter. Stop living as if you had infinite chances to start over. You live each day as if it were chosen, not inherited, as if it were a gift, not an obligation, as if it were unique, because it is. Death doesn't paralyze you, it awakens you to the sacred urgency of truly living. Now, not later, not when you have more time, more money, more security, but now, with what you have, as you are, where you are. And when you live like this, when you embrace finitude instead of denying it, you finally understand what it means to be present. Presence isn't a meditation technique, isn't effort, isn't something you do. It's the natural consequence of a simple life. Thoreau was present because there was nothing between him and the moment. No regret from the past, no anxiety about the future, no fantasy about being somewhere else with other people doing other things. Simplifying removes the temporal and spatial barriers that prevent you from being here, now, whole. Because when you're not carrying the weight of 1,000 commitments, of 1,000 expectations, of 1,000 social roles, you can simply be, and being is much harder and much simpler than doing. You realize you spent your entire life doing to avoid being, because being requires you to face what you are, without disguises, without excuses, without distractions. And this is terrifying, but it's also the only thing worth it. And at the center of this being, this presence, is something Thoreau called spirituality, but not the spirituality of churches, of doctrines, of empty rituals, but a lived, experienced, felt spirituality. For him, God wasn't in sacred books, wasn't in Sunday sermons, wasn't in memorized prayers. God was in the bird's song, in the lake's reflection, in the cycle of seasons, in the raw and sacred reality of existence. Simplifying means leaving conceptual religion and entering direct experience of the sacred. And the sacred isn't something separate from life, isn't something you access in special moments, in special places, with special people. The sacred is life itself when you're present in it. You stop believing in ideas about life and start living life as everyday mystical experience, where washing dishes can be prayer, where walking can be meditation, where breathing can be gratitude. The spiritual stops being Sunday only and becomes daily, stops being exception and becomes rule, stops being escape from the world and becomes deep dive into the world as it is, sacred because it's real. And in this dive, in this presence, in this radical simplicity, you discover something that completely changes your relationship with the concept of wealth. Thoreau said a man is rich in proportion to the things he can do without, and this phrase alone destroys all the logic of capitalism, all the advertising you've consumed since childhood, the whole idea that you need to have more to be more. Real wealth isn't in accumulating, it's in not needing. And when you realize this, when you really understand this, you see you've had everything all along. Time, presence, freedom, silence, the capacity to feel, to think, to love, to exist. But you were too busy chasing what would never make you whole, running after goals that weren't yours, trying to fill a void that only existed because you weren't present in your own life. And now that you're present, now that you've simplified, now that you've removed everything that wasn't vital, you realize the search is over, not because you found what you were looking for out there, but because you stopped searching and started living. And living, really living, was what you always wanted. But nobody taught you that you already could, that you already had permission, that you didn't need to conquer anything before allowing yourself to exist fully. But most people never discover this because most people never simplify, never remove the layers, never face the silence, never cross the fear of freedom. And it's not their fault, because simplifying goes against everything society teaches you, against the whole structure that depends on you believing you're not enough, that you need more, better, different. Simplifying is a revolutionary act. It's internal civil disobedience. It's refusing the script they sold you and writing your own, even without knowing if it will work out, even without guarantees, even with fear. And Thoreau did this in 1845, and people thought he was crazy, radical, irresponsible. But he wasn't running from life. He was entering it for the first time. And what he discovered there, in that simple cabin, in that fertile silence, in that sacred solitude, was something that remains valid today. Maybe more valid than ever, because today the noise is even greater. The distractions are even more sophisticated. The layers are even thicker. You gradually, but with growing clarity, realize that most of the emergencies that consume your life daily, that steal your peace, that justify your constant anxiety, are sophisticated illusions that you yourself created or that you accepted creating without questioning their real validity. In complicated and fragmented life, everything seems urgent all the time. Everything demands immediate response without reflection. Everything presents itself as a matter of life or death that can't wait even a second. But in simple and integrated life, almost nothing is really urgent when you look honestly. Almost nothing needs an answer right now without time to think. Almost nothing justifies sacrificing your inner peace that took so much time and effort to build. Thoreau observed with a mixture of compassion and perplexity that people around him constantly drowned in problems they themselves created through unnecessary commitments, frantically running from one side to the other, solving fabricated crises that only existed because they had accepted living in an excessively complicated way, because they had said yes to too many things, because they didn't have the courage to establish clear boundaries. When you deliberately remove the emotional excess that dramatizes everything, when you consciously stop reacting to every minor stimulus as if it were an existential threat, when you develop the capacity to distinguish between what's really important and what only seems important because it's screaming louder, approximately 90% of your crises simply disappear because they were never genuinely real. They were just noise being exponentially amplified by fear, by deep insecurity, by the neurotic need to feel important and necessary through constant drama. You finally learn to clearly distinguish the urgent from the important, the real from the invented, your problem from others' problems that you assumed as yours. And this seemingly simple distinction is profoundly liberating, because now you can consciously choose where to put your limited attention, your finite energy, your life that doesn't come back, instead of being passively dragged by the relentless current of urgencies completely manufactured by a system that profits from your anxiety. And when you make these choices consciously, when you decide based on your values and not on what the market is selling, you experience something few people experience: integrity. Your choices align with your values, and this is no small thing, because most people live in constant contradiction, saying one thing and doing another, valuing one thing and pursuing another, wanting one thing and choosing another. Thoreau rejected the American dream of his time, the idea that you had to work hard, accumulate properties, climb the social hierarchy, because none of this resonated with his essence. He wasn't being rebellious for rebellion's sake. He was being honest, and honesty required him to choose differently, to live differently, to be different. And when you simplify, When your decisions stop being reactions to the world and become emanations of your being, you live from the inside out, not the other way around. And this inversion changes everything, because now you're no longer a mirror, you're a source. And being a source means you no longer need constant validation, perpetual approval, external confirmation that you're on the right path. You become less impressionable and more awake, immune to the external spectacle that tries to seduce you every second. Thoreau wasn't impressed by wealth, by status, by technological novelties, by promises of progress, because he had solid internal criteria, built on direct experience, not on others' opinions. When your inner life is rich, when you cultivate presence, silence, reflection, genuine connection with yourself, the outer world loses its power to seduce or control you. You become sovereign of your attention, of your time, of your energy. And this sovereignty is what everyone seeks when they pursue success, fame, money, power. But these paths never lead to sovereignty. They only lead to more dependence, more need, more emptiness. Real sovereignty comes from simplicity, from the capacity to not need, to not depend, to not sell yourself for crumbs of approval or temporary comfort. And in the middle of this sovereignty, this real freedom, you discover that boredom isn't your enemy, it's your teacher. In the society of excess, boredom is public enemy number one, something to be avoided at all costs, immediately filled with entertainment, with work, with anything that keeps you busy. But Thoreau spent hours observing the lake, the sky, the apparent nothing, and it's in conscious boredom that creativity is born, that clarity emerges, that insight appears. When you stop running from emptiness, when you inhabit boredom without desperation, you discover it was never empty. It was just fertile silence waiting to be inhabited. It was just space where something new could be born. Every artist, every thinker, every creator knows this. Creation needs emptiness, needs space, needs boredom, because it's in the apparent nothing that the real something emerges. But you won't discover this if you're always busy, always distracted, always running from yourself, through infinite scrolling. The next series, the next commitment that keeps you away from the inevitable encounter with who you really are. And who you really are can only be discovered in simplicity, in silence, in solitude, in presence, in everything Thoreau teaches you when you really read Walden. Not as a self-help book, not as a minimalism manual, but as an invitation to demolish your life and rebuild it from scratch. This time consciously, this time deliberately, this time for real. Because the life you're living now, this complicated life, full of noise, full of obligations that aren't yours, full of desires that aren't yours, full of fears that aren't yours, this life isn't yours. It's borrowed, it's inherited, it's copied from models that never worked for anyone, but that everyone follows because it's easier to follow than to create, safer to imitate than to risk, more comfortable to pretend than to be. But Thoreau shows you there's another path, a path harder at the beginning, lonelier in the middle, truer at the end, a path where you stop being a character and become a person again, where you stop having life and start living, where you stop seeking and start being. And being is scary, because being means assuming total responsibility for your existence, without excuses, without culprits, without justifications. But being is also liberating, because when you really are, you realize you never needed permission, never needed validation, never needed anything beyond what you already have. A body that breathes, a mind that thinks, a heart that feels, and time, some time. Not infinite, but enough if you use it well. If you don't waste it on what doesn't matter. If you consciously choose where to put your life while it's still yours. Because it won't be forever, and Thoreau knew this, and you know this, but knowing intellectually isn't the same as living knowing, and living knowing changes everything. Changes how you wake up, how you eat, how you work, how you love, how you choose, how you exist. And in the end, simplifying isn't about having less, it's about being more present, more true, more whole, more alive. It's about stopping chasing what you never missed and starting to value what was always there, but you were too busy to notice. It's about recognizing you're already rich, you always were, but in a way the world doesn't teach, in a way the market doesn't sell, in a way only direct experience can reveal. And Thoreau lived this, tested this, proved this, not as theory, but as life, and then returned to the city, not because he failed, not because he gave up, but because he had already learned what he needed to learn, had already lived what he needed to live, had already become who he really was. And now you can do the same. You don't need to go to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. You don't need to abandon everything. You don't need to be externally radical, but you need to be internally radical. You need to question everything. You need to remove what isn't vital. You need to face the silence. You need to cross the fear. You need to choose again, this time consciously. And if you do this, if you really simplify, you'll discover what Thoreau discovered, that true life was always available. You were just too busy living the false life to notice. And now that you've noticed, now that you know, the only question that remains is, do you have the courage to change? Because knowing isn't enough, understanding isn't enough, agreeing isn't enough. You need to act, you need to choose, you need to live. And living requires courage, requires honesty, requires willingness to disappoint some people, to lose some friends, to abandon some dreams that were never yours. But it also requires willingness to find yourself, to recognize yourself, to embrace yourself, to become whole for the first time in your life. And when you become whole, when you really simplify, when you remove all the layers and are left with only the essential, you realize the essential was always you, was always life happening now, was always the pure presence of existence, without needing to be more, without needing to have more, without needing to do more, just being, just living, just breathing this moment as if it were the only one, because it is. And Thoreau knew this, and now you know it too. And knowing this changes everything. Even if nothing changes on the outside, inside everything has already changed. And the inside is what matters. It always was. It always will be. If this video touched something in you, if any of these words resonated with some truth you already knew but were avoiding recognizing, leave a like down here and subscribe to the channel. Because this type of content isn't algorithm, it's commitment. It's honest conversation about what really matters, about how to truly live in a world that teaches you to pretend. And if you have something to say about this, leave it here in the comments. Until the next video.